July 27, 2025, Oslo, Norway. In a small, quiet room surrounded by glass and pinewood, 5 names were read aloud by the Nobel Committee. But only one name made the room fall utterly still. Not a general from Geneva, not a former president from New York. No, it was Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old interim president of Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa. For a brief moment, time stopped. Traoré is no ordinary nominee. He didn't rise through Ivy League schools or polished elections. He rose through hunger, through drought, through war, and instead of clinging to power or foreign loans, he picked up a shovel. He returned land to farmers. He built schools with the money saved from cutting bureaucrats. He pardoned former militants and gave them tools instead of guns. And he did it all not for applause, but because he believed his people deserved to live with dignity. Now, this man, once called a rebel soldier, is being considered for the world's most prestigious Peace Prize. At a time when peace is too often negotiated in expensive hotel ballrooms and televised summits, Ibrahim Traoré reminds us of something older and perhaps more honest. Peace is not a performance. Peace is a practice. It is something you sow into the ground and teach in classrooms. So we ask you, especially those who've watched the world for decades, can peace still be real if it doesn't come from a ballot box but from the hands of a farmer in uniform? Is this the kind of leadership the world has waited for, or are we still clinging to outdated definitions of progress? Please share if you believe real peace is built, not declared. Subscribe if you feel the world needs fewer promises and more planted trees. The news broke quietly at first. A press release from Oslo, a few murmurs on global news tickers. But then came the aftershock, not in Europe, but in the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Tens of thousands gathered in makeshift vigils, their hands clasped in prayer, disbelief, and pride. For them, the nomination of President Ibrahim Traoré to the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize was not just recognition, it was redemption. For too long, Burkina Faso had lived in the shadow of conflict, colonization, and poverty. Once a nation known more for refugee camps than for resilience, it had become, under Traoré's leadership, something unexpected, a symbol of hope. Since assuming power on September 29, 2022, Traoré has embarked on a campaign that defied every conventional expectation of a military leader. There were no lavish presidential palaces or speeches filled with promises. Instead, there were long walks through rural fields, listening tours, campfire meetings in broken villages, and then reforms radical yet rooted in common sense. One of the earliest and boldest acts of his presidency was the return of 3.88 million hectares of farmland land that had been quietly leased out to foreign corporations for years, leaving local farmers landless and bitter. Traoré's decision sent a shockwave through financial centers in Europe and boardrooms in Dubai. But in the villages of Burkina Faso, it brought tears. Mothers danced. Elders blessed the soil. Children watched as their fathers returned to fields once taken from them. But land was only the beginning. In the first 18 months of his presidency, Traoré's administration built over 2,400 schools and 700 rural health centers, most of them in remote areas previously untouched by state infrastructure. Unlike foreign aid projects that often stall for years, these were built quickly with local labor and local materials, part of his Dignity Through Work initiative. He slashed government luxury spending by 60%, eliminated non-essential travel, and reduced the salaries of top ministers. The money saved was poured into rural education and basic health care. And in every school built, meals were guaranteed. Over 95% of rural primary school children now receive free lunches sourced from local farmers. Then came a decision that stunned even his critics. Rather than continuing endless battles with extremist groups, many of which had grown from desperation and distrust, Traoré extended an olive branch, not a rifle. His administration began negotiating local peace deals, offering amnesty and vocational training to militants willing to lay down arms. Over 12,000 former fighters accepted the offer. They were resettled, retrained, and in many cases hired as agricultural workers under the newly formed Farmers of Peace program. Traoré understood something that many leaders miss. You cannot bomb people into peace. You must offer them a future. But perhaps the most visionary project of all was the creation of the Sahel Life Alliance, a regional pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger aimed at ecological restoration across the semi-arid Sahel region. In just over a year, the alliance planted 800 million trees, combating desertification and building green jobs in regions long forgotten by modern industry. It was peace not negotiated in fancy hotels, but grown one seedling at a time. These achievements were not announced with pomp. There were no PR firms, no think tank consultants, just farmers, teachers, and community leaders working side by side. But the world took notice, quietly at first, then unmistakably. And so on that morning in Oslo, when Ibrahim Traoré's name was read, it wasn't just a nomination. It was a statement, a challenge to how we define peace in the 21st century. A man who rose through the ranks not of politics but of the people, a leader who didn't build tanks but clinics, who didn't pose for photos but stood in mud with children and teachers and former fighters. For the people of Burkina Faso, this wasn't just their leader's moment. It was their own. The turning point didn't come with a gunshot or an election speech. It came from a place few expected: the Vatican. On July 1, 2025, during the annual Feast of All Saints, Pope Leo XIII, a man known for his deep commitment to social justice and economic dignity, paused during his address and said, "The unthinkable. When I pray for peace, the face of a young soldier from Burkina Faso appears in my mind. He does not preach through scripture or law, but through sweat and soil." That single sentence broke centuries of silence. For the first time in modern papal history, the Vatican publicly endorsed a sitting African leader not just as a man of peace, but as a worthy candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. The news traveled fast. In Ouagadougou Church, bells rang in rural parishes, not to announce Mass, but to celebrate the words of a pope who had never set foot in Burkina Faso, but had seen its fields from afar. It was more than symbolism. It was canonization through labor. The Vatican's official nomination became the spark that lit a fire across diplomatic circles. Within 48 hours, global responses poured in. From Paris President Anne-Luc Moreau, a moderate technocrat often skeptical of post-colonial African populism, offered a rare nod. "We may not agree with all of Mr. Traoré's methods, but we cannot ignore the results." He is writing a new chapter in Africa's story with action, not aid. It was a reluctant admiration, the kind offered by a nation still wrestling with its colonial past. France had once ruled Burkina Faso with an iron hand. Now it watched that same nation dictate a new moral vocabulary to the world. In Washington, Secretary of State Janet R. Collins was more cautious. "We respect the nomination and acknowledge Mr. Traoré's role in fostering regional stability. This is a moment to reflect on what peace means in our time." Diplomatic, polished, but beneath the surface, the discomfort was clear. Traoré had rejected IMF loans. He expelled foreign mining firms. He banned GMO imports. He was not playing by the global rulebook. He was writing his own. And still, his people were rising not in rebellion, but in self-reliance. In Brazil, however, the tone was different. President Luiz G. Costa, a former union organizer, didn't mince words. "I once called him the new Sankara. He corrected me and said, 'I'm just a farmer in uniform.' That's when I knew he deserved the Nobel." The South heard the signal. In Buenos Aires, Lima, and Johannesburg, editorials celebrated Traoré not just as an African leader, but as a representative of a wider global South awakening. In Moscow, the Kremlin was direct. President Dmitry Alexeyev said, "He is not a strategist of ideology, but a builder of futures, of clinics, of forests, of belief." Each capital saw something different. To Europe, he was an anomaly. To America, a challenge. To the global South, a brother. To Russia and China, a shift in the wind. But to his own people, he was everything. By July 27th, the city of Ouagadougou was glowing. Homemade lanterns lit up the dusty night. Vendors sold roasted peanuts and besap. Elders sat on plastic chairs holding radios to their ears, and children held signs that read, "We no longer beg. Now the world listens." The impact was not confined to Burkina Faso. In Bamako and Niamey, murals of Traoré appeared overnight, painted by youth collectives who projected his speeches onto neighborhood walls. In Lagos, a student tweeted, "He didn't wear a suit. He wore boots. He didn't go to Davos. He went to the farms. That's why this Nobel matters." Universities across Africa organized panels, poetry readings, and vigils. In Kinshasa, students formed a human chain that spelled "On board Nobel for Africa," visible from drone footage. At the grassroots level, the peace wasn't just symbolic, it was working. Terror attacks had dropped 70% in the Sahel. School attendance was at an all-time high. More than 80% of rural clinics reported full staffing and supplies. And for the first time in decades, mothers slept without fear of night raids. Former fighters tilled maize fields, their uniforms now bearing the words "Farmers of Peace." In every corner of the Sahel, something old and sacred was returning trust. But not everyone rejoiced. Some Western analysts warned of precedents, fearing that Traore's recognition might embolden other military-led governments. In African Union circles, debate broke out over whether its rapid response mechanisms built to isolate coup leaders were now outdated. One commissioner speaking anonymously said, "We can no longer judge leaders by how they came to power, but by what they do once they have it." This was the new dilemma. Do we cling to ideals, or do we honor impact the world had to choose? At sunrise on July 28, 2025, a single banner stretched between two acacia trees outside Thomas Sankara Square read, "This is not a prize for a man. This is a moment for a continent." What began as a global nomination had now become a national affirmation. But beyond the headlines and applause, the real impact of Ibrahim Traoré's leadership was visible not in press conferences, but in fields clinics and community halls across Burkina Faso. In the once-abandoned northern province of Yatenga, a former conflict zone, schoolchildren now wore clean uniforms, walking barefoot, but proud to class under roofs made of local brick and community labor. Each school was named after either a fallen teacher or a peacemaker, a reminder that this education was not a gift, but a legacy built on sacrifice. At rural health centers, mothers carried infants wrapped in colorful pagnies, lined up quietly for vaccinations. The centers, many of them built in just under 3 months, were staffed by young nurses from the National Civic Corps, a program launched by Traore to replace elite bureaucracies with trained local volunteers. Posters on the wall read, "Peace is a healthy child. Dignity is a healed mother." In villages where militants once ruled with fear, former fighters now harvested corn and sweet potatoes under the banner of the Farmers of Peace. Their weapons surrendered, their scars visible. They now wore overalls labeled not with military ranks but with names like Jean the Replanter or Sita the Teacher. Some had returned to the very villages they once attacked, now seeking forgiveness through work, not words. One such man, Adama Diallo, told a local journalist, "I was lost. He, Traoré, gave me a chance to be useful, not feared, just useful." But this transformation was not confined to the countryside. In the capital, Ouagadougou public squares, once filled with protests, now hosted night schools for working adults. The national radio shifted from broadcasting political sermons to airwaves filled with folk music, public service announcements, and agricultural tips. The Ministry of Peace and Reconciliation, once mocked as symbolic, now coordinated over 100 pardoned ex-militants, placing them in community farms, irrigation teams, and teacher training programs. What made it different was not just the scale, it was the tone. The entire apparatus of state governance had shifted from command to collaboration. Meanwhile, civil society, often sidelined in military regimes, experienced a quiet renaissance. Women's cooperatives expanded rapidly, especially in the Kulpelogo region, where over 300 female-led groups were granted access to microloans and farmland. In a country where women were often left out of land discussions, this was more than inclusion. It was a reversal of history. Political scientists were stunned. The metrics were clear. Infant mortality dropped by 18% in a year. Primary school enrollment rose from 67% to 84%. Food security stabilized across 11 out of 13 regions. But beyond numbers, the air itself seemed to change. In the words of journalist Marie Gonsaret, "You can feel it in the silence of a night without gunfire." That silence is what peace sounds like. Neighboring countries began to take notice. On July 29th, just 2 days after the Nobel nomination, the presidents of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood shoulder to shoulder at a press conference in Ouagadougou. Their message was solemn and direct. This nomination is not a personal crown. It is proof that Africa can write its own story. They announced the launch of the Joint Civil Command of the Sahel, a civilian-focused alliance to coordinate efforts in food production, rural education, trauma counseling, and media literacy, effectively expanding the military alliance into a social development front. Even Guinea, Chad, and Togo, once cautious of Traoré's rise, issued statements of congratulations, hinting at deeper regional realignment. The African Union, too, was forced to reckon with this shift. Until then, the AU's protocols were designed to isolate leaders who came to power via military means. But now the debate changed. In closed-door sessions, one senior AU official admitted, "We cannot continue to judge governments by the method of arrival. We must evaluate their commitment to public good." Burkina Faso's experience triggered working groups to reconsider AU's rapid response mechanism with proposals to include impact-based legitimacy reviews, placing health, education, and social metrics above procedural orthodoxy. The conversation across Africa had changed. No longer was the central question, did he win power the right way? It had become, what did he do with the power once he had it? And for millions of Burkinabe, the answer was all around them. In the polished corridors of Washington, Brussels, and Geneva, the nomination of Ibrahim Traoré posed a quiet dilemma. On paper, the world should celebrate a man who turned battlefields into classrooms and former militants into farmers. But beneath the surface, a deeper unease settled in. For decades, Africa had been seen and treated as a problem to be managed, a place for peacekeeping missions, conditional loans, and carefully packaged development assistance. Now, a 36-year-old soldier who rejected that entire framework was being considered for the world's highest peace honor. In Washington, while official statements from the State Department emphasized respect for the nomination, the tone was diplomatic, not warm. The White House press secretary was asked directly if Traoré's rise through a military transition disqualified him from such honors. She replied, "We believe democracy and free elections are cornerstones of legitimacy. That said, we acknowledge progress where it occurs." Behind closed doors, however, the questions were more pointed. What happens if other African countries follow Traoré's model? What if rejecting IMF loans and expelling foreign contractors becomes the new norm? What if peace can be built without our aid or our permission? In European capitals, particularly France, the reaction was one of conflicted admiration. President Alain-Luc Moreau walked a fine line, calling Traoré a complex figure, but admitting that his results cannot be ignored. In the media, some outlets praised his achievements, while others warned of legitimizing authoritarian governance. But outside these centers of power, the narrative was shifting. In Latin America, leaders from Brazil, Bolivia, and Colombia openly praised Traoré, calling him a model for post-colonial development. In India and Indonesia, editorials compared him to Gandhi, not in nonviolence but in self-reliance. In South Africa, veteran journalist Nomsa Dlamini wrote, "The West fears Traoré not because he is dangerous, but because he is effective and not dependent." Global financial institutions, including the World Bank, began to soften their tone, quietly reopening communication channels with Burkina Faso, a shift that would have been unthinkable just months prior. The Nobel nomination had changed the conversation. Africa was no longer asking for a seat at the table, it was building its own. As the world counts down to December 10th, 2025, the day the Nobel Peace Prize will be awarded in Oslo, one question quietly echoes across continents. What if the winner is not a man of diplomacy, but a man of dirt-stained boots? Whether Ibrahim Traoré receives the prize or not, something irreversible has happened. A poor, landlocked nation that once struggled in silence has forced the world to listen. Not through war, not through headlines, but through action. Children now read under trees that were once cut down for firewood. Ex-fighters now irrigate maize instead of planting mines. And mothers once afraid of nightfall now hum songs as they cook school meals. This is not the kind of peace we're used to celebrating. It doesn't come with treaties or press releases. It comes with calloused hands, forgiven hearts, and a willingness to start again from the ground up. But with recognition comes risk. World powers don't easily accept models they can't control. Institutions don't reward those who operate outside their system. And Traoré, for all his humility, is not just building farms. He's building a mirror, a reflection of what leadership could look like if it served people instead of profit. And mirrors make empires nervous. As the cameras prepare to focus on Oslo, the real test may not be the prize, but what follows. Will the world embrace a new model of peace, or quietly try to erase it? Traoré himself seems to know what's at stake. From the balcony of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, he recently told a silent crowd, "This nomination belongs to every mother who fed a child from her own field, to every youth who picked up a shovel instead of a rifle, to every teacher who taught under a tree." We are building peace not to impress the world but to survive. And so we leave you with this. Is this the kind of leader Africa needs and the world fears? Can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should we support someone else to succeed him? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.